Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics, as always brought to you by you with your support on Patron.com. Today I'm joined by Dr. Joanna Leidenhag. She completed her PhD in systematic and philosophical theology at the University of Edinburgh. She does a lot of work in analytic, philosophy of mind, and the doctrine of creation. So we're going to be talking about those two topics today, the doctrine of creation, consciousness, so much fun stuff. But Dr. Leidenhag, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited for this conversation to talk about like creation and consciousness and how the mind fits into all of it. There's so much fun stuff here, so many big questions. But before we get into that, can you talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do in case someone doesn't know who you are?
Of course. So yes, my name's Joanna Leidenhag, and I work at the University of St Andrews currently as a lecturer in science-engaged theology. So I work in the theology department. I'm a systematic theologian thinking about the Christian faith, thinking about what kind of truth claims the Christian faith can and does make. And I'm trying to do that in the dialogue with the natural sciences as well.
Yeah, that's so much fun. So what got you interested in like the doctrine of creation and these big questions surrounding like the topic that we're going to be discussing today?
Yeah, so I got into the doctrine of creation for kind of two reasons. On the one hand, as someone interested in science and religion, science and Christianity in particular, the doctrine of creation is like an obvious place within Christian teaching to spend one's time, to think about and to read about, because it's the doctrine of creation that I think grounds our understanding of what nature is, that the natural sciences are investigating, right? So there's an automatic series of questions that flow out of the science-religion kind of dialogue. The other reason is I was actually more interested initially in humanity, in what's called theological anthropology, what it means to be human, what it means to be made in the image of God. But I quickly discovered or thought that actually you can't understand what it means to be human if you don't understand creation, because first and foremost, humans are creatures. We are members of God's creation. We're part of God's creation. We're not different fundamentally from creation. We're made on the sixth day along with all the other animals, right, in the stories of Genesis. So I think we need to understand the doctrine of creation before we can really understand theological anthropology. So I got drawn into the doctrine of creation for those two reasons.
Yeah, and it's going to be a really interesting doctrine to talk about today. But for you, like you and your views, consciousness is such a very important thing with like the doctrine of creation. It's something that I didn't like put together for a little bit until like I've listened to you and heard of it, and it makes more sense as I think about it. Because you talk about how like consciousness is such an important thing to think about as we get into like this idea of the doctrine of creation.
Right. So exactly tying into what I just said about having to put humanity in creation, in our thinking, as it were. That goes for consciousness too. So consciousness is often reserved very absolutely for humanity in our philosophical and theological discussions. But even if it is just reserved for humanity, it's therefore part of creation, because humanity is part of creation. So I wanted to move our discussions of consciousness in the mind out of a kind of separate sphere that makes it very difficult to understand, and put it in a Christian context of the doctrine of creation. So my own understanding is something a little wacky, but I think it could be right. At least it could be. And that's called Panpsychism, which suggests that consciousness is more widespread to creation than we normally think of. And I think this view doesn't need to suggest anything unchristian or unorthodox. So it doesn't need to suggest pantheism or pantheism or polytheism. It can be a thoroughly Christian view that God creates consciousness, and consciousness is fundamental to God's creation.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to like understand your view a little bit here on panpsychism, because I'm no expert on this topic, but just trying to understand it. So would you say that kind of like we have God, who's like the fundamental source of reality, who's conscious, and he creates like our universe, and like with like every like little bit of matter or electron, like he also creates like a little bit of consciousness into like each bit of matter? Or is that kind of how that would work?
That's roughly how it would view. So when God creates everything from nothing, which is how I think God created, consciousness was part of that everything, as it were, that God creates at the beginning from nothing. It's not something that God interjects into creation later on, say with the evolution or emergence of the human species. I think consciousness is part of the basic ingredients of our our natural universe, of our created universe.
Yeah, so I think it'd be helpful at this point just to give like a very like we talked about like God creating consciousness and panpsychism, but just give a very quick like overview of your view of like how do we get from like God creating the universe to like us existing, because there's all different kinds of like models. Like, is the earth 6,000 years old? Was it like gaps of creation? Is it just like evolution and natural processes with God kind of like steering it? So like, could you give like a brief overview on like kind of like your view of like how we get to where we are today, especially with like regards to like the origin of man?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I've said, I think consciousness is one of the many ingredients of the created world, of the natural order, and therefore after that, I actually just want to follow what I see to be the scientific standard story of evolution, but without the philosophical importation that means atheism or naturalism. I think we can have a story of very slow evolutionary change and development, mutation, genetic inheritance, that tracks pretty much identically onto the standard scientific picture, and includes consciousness in that evolution. So through the processes of evolution, as matter becomes more complex, more complexly integrated, forms more intricate structures that can do more amazing things. So as brains develop effectively from single-celled organism to multi-celled organisms to very complex nervous systems that we find in humanity and a wide range of other animal species, then consciousness, like matter, gets more complicated. It gets more sophisticated, and we get what we currently experience and think of as minds, as subjects, evolving out of the basic building blocks of the natural world. And this allows us to say that humanity, because we have the most sophisticated bodies in the sense of integrated brains and nervous systems, it makes sense that we would have the most sophisticated minds, that we would be more intelligent, more creative, and all those sorts of things, self-conscious, and that would actually be fairly unique to humanity, while still saying that other animals can have some level of mind or some level of intelligence too. So people experience this maybe with their pets. We acknowledge that other species can build nests, or like there's clearly some mentality going on there, but it's not as sophisticated as humanity. But this evolutionary picture can give us that, I think, in quite a realistic way.
Yeah, this is great, and it's a good transition as we're going to talk about like the evolutionary process and like why would God use evolution and natural, even all these like fun and important questions that kind of come from like this basic ideas that you're kind of bringing forth here. But before we get into some of the specifics, I think it'd be helpful to just talk about like the problem of evil in general. In the past, some philosophers would have said like it's just logically incompatible that there could be like all loving God and evil. There's all different varieties of it. Like, how would you respond to like the general challenge of the problem of evil? Like, why? If we have like an all perfect, all loving God that exists, why do we experience evil today and like death, like even like back before there were humans? So it's like the evolutionary kind of like idea.
Yeah, I think I think it's a mistake to think that there's a general problem of evil. A general problem of evil can only give a very general answer, right? And actually, it's often much more helpful if we break this down into smaller problems, and because there are actually lots of problems here. Like, let's be honest about that. It's not an easy area for theology or philosophy for anybody. That we should have very different answers to the pastoral problem of evil, as it were, than to a logical problem of evil versus an evidentialist problem of evil. The idea that evil is evidence against God versus the idea that evil is incompatible logically with belief in God. These are very different challenges, actually, and I don't think it makes sense to talk of a general challenge. I think we always have to get more specific than that. But I would say that, and that means that there's a range of different types of answers that a theologian or a Christian can make, right? So you have to first work out what is the actual question I'm being asked. Am I being asked, why did God let this happen to me, right? Which is a very different question to how can we explain death before human origins, right?
Yeah.
They're just completely different questions. But they both come under this very large umbrella that we call the problem of evil. So that's my initial response.
Yeah. So it'd be helpful to kind of dive into these specific things that we'll be talking about here the next 10, 20 minutes or so. But the first thing I want to talk about with regards to evolution is it seems like a lot of people, it's like in Europe or stuff, but at least in the United States where I'm from, it's like evolution versus creation. Like there's no way these two ideas can kind of like fit together. Like if evolution's true, then God is dead and Christians should just pack up their bags and go home and it's over. So like why do you think that like this theory of evolution is just totally compatible with like a Christian theism that we would like experience and we would believe in?
Again, there's a number of ways that evolution and Christianity can be discussed. So, and this goes actually for the evolution and Christianity debate and the what I just said about the problem of evil is often a lot of Christian responses aren't about proving the truth of one's own position so much as showing that the problems that people think are there aren't really problems. So a common one is the idea that say Christianity says that God created the earth in 7 days because that's what we find in Genesis 1. And it just takes some, in one sense, fairly basic or biblical studies knowledge to know that the book of Genesis is not a scientific text. That it's doing quite different work, that days didn't necessarily correspond to 24-hour periods, which wouldn't make any sense before the invention of the sun anyway. And those sorts of things, like it quickly breaks down the idea. And then you discover that in the history of Christianity, very few theologians have taught that that's what Genesis 1 means. It's actually not something that people widely considered to be what Genesis 1 was for or what it was about until really the late 19th and early 20th century, right? So this sets up a problem that isn't really a problem. And this can be true of all different parts of the evolution Christianity debate, that we think we see a problem, and often the work of I think a Christian apologist isn't to say I'm right, you're wrong. It's to say actually this isn't so much of a problem.
Yeah, this is great. So one thing I want to talk about is like from a Christian perspective here with like regards to the theory of evolution is the question of like why I think God would use evolution as like the process for like originating human beings. Like if we think about it, we have like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being, and there's a lot of different ways he could have created you and me, but it seems like he may have used this like process of evolution to create us. So like from like a theological perspective, like answering like the Christian, why would God use a process like evolution to kind of create you and me?
It's a hard one to think about. Just like what other options could God have is a hard question to think about, because God didn't use any other options. He made us this way, right? So it's thinking through the counterfactual is very difficult. And so it's very difficult for us, if not impossible, to really weigh the pros and cons of different methods of which God could have used to create. Because we don't know what those pros and cons would be, because we've actually only got one reality to grasp on. And so we can see pros and cons in this reality. We can see the pros in the sense of a wide diversity of life forms, great integrity in not just creating things kind of by divine fiat out of with only God's power, but actually giving power to creation. To create is a beautiful thing, and shows that God's power is one of empowerment of others rather than a kind of power that controls and dominates, right? And that's also testified in the story of Jesus and in the Holy Spirit in the church. It's an empowering of the weak, making the weak strong, right? And so we can have a kind of theological view of some of the benefits of evolution that way, and we can have a theological view of some of the costs of evolution, the competition, the death, but at the same time, it's hard to, I think those have been a little overemphasized. So just where there's competition, survival of the fittest, there's also cooperation between species, and even some minimal levels of altruism in evolution. The two go hand in hand. I don't think evolution is an inherently bad, evil, or immoral way for God to have chosen natural processes to work, but I don't think it's amazingly good either. I think it's kind of ambiguous. I think you can view it both ways.
Yeah, this is great. So, kind of going into like the theory of evolution from maybe like the atheist perspective here, they can look at the data and just see evidence that supports evolution. They just wonder, like, how could like an all-loving God allow this? Because yes, evolution would have lots of cooperation, lots of life, but also it would involve lots of death, lots of like things like suffering or starvation, or all these like seemingly very like horrendous evils. So like answering from like an atheistic kind of like argument, like why would God allow, if he creates, to use a process that involves like this much seemingly meaningless like suffering and death, when he didn't seem like he would have had to?
I mean, I don't know whether God had to or not. I don't know what options there could be, and I don't also think that God owes us an answer to that. I think we can be perplexed by it. I think God allows, and sometimes in the Bible even encourages us to bring these hard questions. Why would you do it that way? And ask for insight. I don't know whether we would get it, but God encourages us to have that kind of relationship where we can ask, and not be ashamed of that. But at the same time, I don't think God owes us an answer. We're part of the creatures here, right? We're not part of we're not the one who decided. And we do know that the life on this earth is highly unusual, the only planet we currently know of that can support really any form of life, sophisticated life, and that the chances of life are so infinitesimally small. So I think it's like, on balance, I mean, again, this is like hugely complex problems that are very hard to think about. And on balance, it's hard to know where to come out. Is life on Earth a kind of miracle, or is it a kind of tragedy because of its cost? And as I say, we kind of want to say both. I don't think it's clear cut. And I also think there has to be something in this conversation, not just of kind of hypotheticals and our views of what it means for God to be good and our views of what it means for God to be rational, and those sorts of things, but also we need to include the Christian narrative into this. So we need to start from an understanding that God too says the world is not as it should be. This isn't the perfect way for the world to be, right? God says that, and maybe the suffering that you're referring to, the evils that you're referring to, are part of that, part of those things that God doesn't want, doesn't intend. It's very hard to be definitive on that, but that's got to be part of the conversation too.
Yeah, this is great. So I think if I'm like kind of like from understanding your perspective, like we have like this very like lots of good reasons to think like they're really God and like Jesus incarnate and like the Christian message, like we can accept this. And we have this like for these reasons. Then we have this like seeming evidence that looks like evolution is true. You could always debate that, but it looks like it's true. And like, why would God use this process? Well, we don't have to have it necessarily the exact answer, but then we'd have all this information like over here that really would suggest that there is a God, that Jesus really did rise from the dead, things like that. So the two fit together some way. It's just we don't have to have all the answers. We can just kind of follow like God's word, like the book of like the law and stuff, and then also like the book of nature. Is that kind of like what your view is regarding like this topic, kind of?
I mean, I certainly don't think we have to have all the answers. I'm sure we'd like to have all the answers, but I don't think we have. I think we will one day. I think that's important to say. I don't think it's that these questions don't matter and that we don't need answers. I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to hope, and in that sense expect, that one day we'll understand. And then the Christian hope and faith comes in, which says that, and on that day we will be able to say it was all worth it. We'll be able to say that it is good, right? Because life triumphs over death. I think without the resurrection of Jesus, we wouldn't be able to say any of that. We'd be able to, we'd just say, why the hell did you do it this way? And I'm not sure you're a good God at all. I think really what the Christian hope and faith in able to affirm the goodness of God, and it is a goodness, as one sense, on faith, is because of the claim that life has already, in some sense, triumphed over evil and over death. That God, we don't really understand why he permits evil, but we know that he's defeated it. And what God has chosen to do about evil is what the Christian witness is about, rather than why God permitted it in the first place. I think that's a question that we can't answer yet.
Yeah, so one more question here, kind of, and then we'll go to a little bit of like live questions. I saw a few already, so we'll get into that for a few minutes. But it's this question of like natural evil. So it's kind of fitting in with like everything we've talked about before. But you know, in our world today, we experience like earthquakes and tsunamis. And if we go back in history, you know, there's all kinds of events. If you go like the evolutionary history, you'd have like, I think it's 5 mass extinction events and like all these seeming like natural evils that can cause all this like seeming like chaos in the world. So when you look at like your view on like God and creation, how do you kind of like understand that with regards to like a loving God? And it seems like all this kind of like almost like chaos happening, not just including humanity, but before humanity came into being. Yeah,
I think we have to be a little more careful with our evaluative judgments, right? So you say chaos. A geologist might tell us, no, this was absolutely necessary for life to emerge. You needed mass volcanic eruptions for the right nutrients to come up from the center of the earth so that carbon-based life forms could develop, right? For example. So I think we have to be a bit careful with what we're labeling chaos and what we're labeling evil, right? So I do think we maybe need to save some space for natural evil, for the category of natural evil. But earthquakes and tsunamis aren't evil in and of themselves. They're evil when we call them evil when lots of people die as a result. But if an earthquake happens and no one's hurt, no one dies, is that an evil event? We probably don't think so. In fact, it's probably a good event for other parts of the for our ecological balance, right? For the things that we need as an individual species and as a whole kind of ecosystem of species independent upon one another and independent on this planet to survive. So these events aren't evil in and of themselves. They're evil because they're mixed up in other forms of structures, of human structures and societies, and can result basically in death. And it's death that we consider evil boils down to most of the time. And again, it's death that Christianity says has been defeated in the resurrection of Jesus, even though we still die. So I think the question of natural evil is difficult, but we first of all need to think about what's really evil about this and what's not evil about it.
Yeah, that's great. So what we'll do now is we'll go to a few live questions, and we'll just kind of do that, and then we'll start to wrap things up here. So if you have questions, super chats, we'll get few. We won't have forever. We'll have a little bit of time here. We did have a super chat from Reho Boy for no idea what that is, but thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. It means a lot. And yeah, it just does. But a question from BDS here, which says, if human consciousness is dependent on the physical human brain, was Jesus qua human not conscious until he was born? So a question here regarding like the incarnation and panpsychism and all this fun stuff. So what's your response to this question?
That's a really great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. I'm not sure how to think about the humanity of Jesus before his birth in general. I think certainly there's some element to which we want to say that God the Son was always intended to be incarnate as the human Jesus Christ. But I don't. But I think I would have to, currently anyway, I've not had very long to think about this one, but I currently think I would have to affirm that there's no human soul of Jesus that pre-exists the incarnation. I think, or human mind of Jesus, that there's God the Son, pre-existent from all eternity, and that God the Son assumes a human nature. And as part of that human nature, he gets a human mind. That's the two minds Christology. But that human mind is inextricably bound to his human body, because it's one holistic human nature. I don't like dividing up humans absolutely into these different parts. I think it's helpful to talk about them. I'm a dualist in that sense, but I don't think you can separate them, and that's part of my panpsychism. So the answer to that question is yes. There's no human consciousness in Jesus, though there is a divine consciousness in Jesus prior to the incarnation.
I'm curious just here for a second with you, talking about like your view in like panpsychism and consciousness, and how that all works with like new creation. Because if like our mind would seemingly like be attached to like our brain, like if we don't have a brain, it seems like we wouldn't have a mind kind of under panpsychism. How does that work with like the new creation? Do we get the same brain, or do we get like our memories put into like a new brain? Like how does that all work with your view regarding like the new creation and panpsychism?
Yeah, so I think so this is so you're really hitting home to like one of the good test questions for how I view humanity as part of creation, right?
Yeah.
Because I think what that means is that the resurrection and at the new creation can't be like, oh, humans are carried on the same, but everything else God can't say everything else, I'm just going to annihilate it and start again. I actually think what we see in the New Testament is a promise for the redemption of all things. And that we use the language of new creation, like I am a new creation type language, but that's not the utter annihilation and start from scratch, as if there was no first creation. It's the redemption of creation, and that means the redemption of the material world, the redemption of my brain as much as of my soul, or of the earth outside, the soil in my garden, as much as of my memories. I think all of these things will be made anew, but with some continuity. So they will still be these things. They will still have, in that sense, a kind of numerical identity, but they will be radically different because there will be no more suffering and no more death and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. We do have another question here from Caruso Apologetics, which says, what view on Genesis 1 through 3 do you hold?
I presume you're meaning how do I've said I don't think there's scientific texts, for example. So I trust my biblical scholar friends on this, my colleagues who work in biblical scholarship, who describe this. Genesis 1 to 11 is really the textual unit, mostly by the priestly authors who are giving a primordial history. So I don't think a physical history or a scientific history, but a primordial history, trying to understand to locate who God is and locate the identity of the people of Israel. In that sense, I'm quite comfortable with the language of myth, but I don't think myth means untruth. Right. So I don't think myth is equivalent to fiction at all. I think myth is a vehicle of carrying truth. It's just not truth like a historical or scientific account of what happened. But I think it can give us I think it's really important truths about our identities, about who God is, about our role, about our vocation. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for your answer. So we are right around, we've answered some questions and stuff, so we're getting close to around time here, but do you have any kind of like last thoughts, things you didn't get to bring up? Because we unpacked a lot here in just only like 30 minutes with like the Doctrine of Creation, Evolution, things you didn't get to say that you want to bring up before we start to wrap things up here?
I guess if you want a concluding thought, it would be that in all of these discussions around, particularly around the problem of evil that we've talked about and evolution, I think we really have to bring them into dialogue with the stories of Jesus and the stories of the New Testament and the narrative of Scripture, rather than get hung up on things that we think Christians have to believe philosophically or scientifically, because Christians are always debating different philosophies and different interdisciplinary or scientific ideas. And I think it's good to debate those. I think it's good to disagree about those. The thing that unites us as Christians is this narrative and this person, Jesus. And I think that's where a lot of our thinking has to be. That would be my advice to people.
Yeah, that's great. So I just want to say thank you so much again for your time, Dr. Leidenhag. It's been so much fun so many great questions that we explored today in just a little bit of time. There's a link down below for people who want to follow your work. You can go to your website and just kind of see everything that's going on there. You've published a lot of papers, so it's pretty cool to see. So thank you everyone for tuning in. If you're new to Adherent Apologetics, as always, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, review. Everything helps. If you enjoy us, you can support us on patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics. Your support means a lot, and you can do that now if you can. That'd be great. But Dr. Leidenhag, one more time, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you everyone for coming on, the programmer, Jacob, Dean, and Super Chat. That support means a lot. And thank you, and have a good one.